And with some more mold making, just like before, we have our chin. So we've got our cowl and we've got the chin, and I have pinned them both to the sculpting head because although we're not going to be using them for the sculpt itself, we kind of need them to get the proportions of the rest of the masking, because now we're actually doing the character for parts, which is going to be the faceplate. So we are going to be sculpting over this somewhat, but also above it. So parts of this are going to have to rise off. And when we make the mold, it's going to have an open back to it. So when we take castings of it, we can inlay some foam or some mesh into it, which will allow the parts of the jaw to actually have that self-supportingness to it. Because of course latex doesn't support itself. That also raises a similar problem. The clay will not support itself. Well, it would do if we were using monster clay, but we're not, because we don't want to take forever with this sculpt. And my experience lies with wedge, which will not support itself on a big extension and elevation out this way, and less so on the head. But when we get around to sculpting Garrus's face, because I want these bits to be generic and then the face to be swap outable depending on which Turian you're trying to be. So we're going to use this stuff, armature wire, which is for building a custom shape that you then sculpt on, and then this supports the weight. Now this is, I think, 5mm armature wire, so it's quite thin, and it's nice and flexible, so we can get it into the exact right proportions. We're going to put down a small base on here, and then we're going to wedge some armature wire into the clay, going back, and then that will support the whole thing all the way through the sculpt. So, should we get started? And starting involves massing out the area in which we're going to sculpt, and here we actually use the prosthetics we've already cast to get a good idea of where this prosthetic wants to lay on the head, so we can sculpt around it using them as a reference, along with, you know, our actual references. So now that we have everything massed out, we're going to put in our armature. So it wants to go just past the chin. About there, which means I shouldn't have taken that chin prosthetic off just yet. But you know what? No one has ever said I'm smart or good at this. And with the armatures being installed, we now have more area that we need to mass out. Areas that aren't actually on the sculpting head. So this is something we have to be quite careful about drying out, because moisture can escape from both in front of the sculpting bit and behind it. So you have to keep it moist. And also, as we're sculpting as well, we need to be careful that we're actually sculpting in additional dimensions, because we're used to having the head behind what we're sculpting, so that we have basically an almost flat canvas to sculpt on, but here we need to add dimensionality to all of it, including the mandibles and the head fronds. I don't know what they're called, they probably have a technical name, like the leku on Twi'lek, but I don't know it, sorry. And just over 2 hours of sculpting gives us our first pass at plotting out all the anatomy, anatomical structures, and the massing out of this character. Lots of little things, like the shape of the lips, the outsides of all of these ridges. They're all very rough at the moment. None of them are particularly accurate or even, but now that we have all of the mass and the volume that all of the sculpt wants to take up, and we don't need to be adding much more bulk to this, we can start sculpting in the details, defining the edges of all of our little effects here, and start making it look a lot more like the character. Our sculpt has now been resting for about 3 days, but we've kept it covered the whole time so it didn't dry out. But I didn't go over the top with the covering because I wanted the clay to get a little bit more clammy so that I could then start to put some of the details in it. And apparently the sculpt thinks it's cool now as well. So, God, what the hell am I even doing? It's hard to give too much advice about tactically dehydrating your water-based clay. It's one of those things that you kind of learn as you go and as you use your clay, because this stuff dries out rather slowly, so you actually have a lot of leeway, so you don't need to be afraid of leaving it that much unlike some other clays, depending on how thick or thin your sculpt is, it will dry at varying rates and crack off eventually. But if you keep it moist, it'll be fine. Or if you don't moisten it and cover it and leave it for a few days, it'll just go more solid, and you can use that to your advantage, like we're about to do. And whilst you're here, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video if you enjoy Mass Effect, and also, this needs a caption. Come on, best captions in the comments below, thanks. Now, let's get back to the sculpt. Going back to the sculpt means we can now get on with the real meat of this task, where we're actually putting all of our details in, getting everything the correct shape, adding, subtracting, doing all of that as we go. Thanks to some lessons I've had at university over sculpting, I've started to sculpt in a slightly different way that really helped with the way that this character came out. You can see, instead of using my knife and putting a lot of clay onto the sculpt and then kind of carving big swathes of it off in the correct shape, what I actually do is start putting on little bits of pea-sized clay with my tool so that I can slowly build things up in the correct proportions. Now, this might be slower for some things, but it allows you to be a lot more accurate with your proportions. And for something like this, which has a lot of small anatomical structures and also is kind of a character that I have a definitive reference of, it is really useful. And one other thing, if I get into the habit of doing it this way, this is a significantly better way to work with monster clay, which is the clay we used for the Jin mask sculpt last year. That is much tougher than this wet clay, and so once it's down, it's much harder to then carve shapes out of it. So if you build it up slowly and kind of just sculpt the bits as they go on, then you're in a much better position. If you want a shortcut on seeing the finished run of this mask, hopefully you watched my MCM London Expo vlog. And also if you're part of some of my different social media streams, like Facebook, Instagram and all of that, you'll have seen the work in progress photos and the photos of it being painted and such. I didn't manage to stream painting it because of the house move, and I needed to get it done in time to wear for London Comic Con. But I definitely need to paint up some more of them, and probably another one for myself, since my first one got worn for 3 days solid, and that's a little bit too much for me to want to put back on again. Now, some of you might be looking at this thinking, how do you mould something like that? And I'll tell you, you kind of don't. What I actually ended up doing is the two mandibles on either side, I actually cut them off and moulded them separately. So the separately moulded ones were then latex in a little plaster mould, and then have some expanding foam in there so that they came out nice and chunky and kept their shape, and then glued onto the mask afterwards. And hopefully you'll agree, it was a really nice effect to get that. Because this mask is going for a one-size-fits-all sort of thing, so I can actually sell copies to other people, I make sure that I'm actually overlapping where the lips are and where it's going over the forehead, because any areas like that can be trimmed down for the wearer. If they're too short, they can't be extended after it's been moulded. So that's just one thing you've got to think about when you're trying to make prosthetics, either for yourself or other people. Now, as we start to get towards the end of this sculpt, you see me using a sponge to go over the clay. That both helps to draw moisture out of the clay and give it a very nice, subtle, dimpled effect. Kind of a bit more like skin than, say, smoothing it with your finger in some water. There are definitely some parts that you want to smooth down, especially around like edges, where you will end up wanting to add edge highlighting in your final masks. And that is one finished mask. Well, mask sculpt, and it's the third sculpt of this one prosthetic appliance. Well, multi-part prosthetic appliance, and it's maybe the most ambitious sculpting project I've taken on so far because it involves so many disparate parts and so many weird instances of moulding and then casting, and it actually came out really well in the end. Unfortunately, it tied up exactly right to overlap with my house move. I don't have much video of it being produced past this point, like the moulding and the casting. However, this is me wearing it at London Comic Con in May of 2017, and you can see it all fits together nicely. It goes on, we've got articulation in the mouth. Unfortunately, I left a lot of my makeup kit at home, so I haven't been able to black out around the eyes, do the neck properly, so you can still see the pink through the mouth. But apart from that, the whole thing goes on so comfortably. And here is a little reward for anybody that's gone through this entire video, me trying to eat a big sloppy chocolate waffle in this mask at Comic-Con. So thank you for watching. Hopefully you'll stick around, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye!